If it's Wednesday, top U.S. national security officials brief Congress. The White House considers a presidential address amid rising tensions with China and new intelligence on the aerial object shot down in U.S. airspace. Plus, challenge accepted. Former Governor and UN Ambassador Nikki Haley holds her first campaign rally as she becomes the first Republican to officially run against former President Donald Trump for the Republican nomination. An illegal case that could dramatically alter abortion access all across the country, despite your state law. As a deadline approaches, a Texas judge could limit the availability of abortion medication nationwide, not just in Texas. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. It is Wednesday. I'm Chuck Todd reporting in Washington, where top White House officials are briefing senators amid concerns about the U.S.'s military readiness when it comes to confronting China. It comes as lawmakers and the public continue to press the White House for answers about the administration's response to the Chinese spy balloon that floated across the country a couple weeks ago and the military's subsequent decision to shoot down 3 other high-altitude objects over North American airspace in the following days. White House officials are now saying that they believe those 3 other objects were essentially harmless and that they were likely tied to commercial or research entities, not to China. That disclosure only raises more questions. What were these objects for? Who do they belong to? Was shooting them down an overreaction? Where do we log this information? Shouldn't we know what's in normal orbit, if you will? And just how many things are in our airspace that the government doesn't know about? In a press conference today in Brussels, Defense Secretary Austin told reporters that he was not aware of any additional objects operating in American airspace in the last 48 hours. Secretary Austin then sat down for an exclusive interview with NBC's Pentagon correspondent Courtney Kube, who asked him about the military's latest assessment of these potential threats, a threat of a story she broke.
Has anyone claimed ownership of the last 3?
No, they haven't. No, you'd think that well, first of all, there are rules that people should follow, and if you're going to launch something that's operating in those spaces, and FAA should be notified, and permissions should be requested. But to answer your question, nobody's claimed. We don't know if how frequently these things may or may not have appeared in our airspace. We're learning a lot more about that. Again, as you heard me say the other night, we know that there are a lot of countries, a lot of companies, scientific experiments that occur in these sometimes in these spaces, but most every time those things are logged and space requested, flight paths logged, and that sort of stuff. Not the case in here.
Courtney's going to join me in a moment with more of that interview. You can watch more of it tonight on the NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt as well. And as we, the public, and elected officials look for more answers about this spate of unidentified aerial phenomenon, White House staff are having their own internal discussions about whether or not the president needs to address this publicly. Maybe tamp down all this UFO nonsense that's out there. White House official tells NBC News that there are active conversations about the right moment for Biden to address the public. The consensus being that the administration needs to wait for more information. Translation, we don't know what those other 3 aerial objects are. And until we know that, we probably can't expect to hear from the president. Joining me now is Courtney Kube, fresh off that interview with Secretary Austin. And on Capitol Hill, correspondent Ryan Nobles is tracking as members of the Senate get this larger briefing on China. And Ryan, let me start with you because I understand that briefing, it might be wrapping up earlier than we expected. Anything dripping out from that briefing? And again, this was, walk me through, this was not a balloon briefing. This was more than that on China.
Yeah, that's right, Chuck. First of all, they are starting to trickle out of this meeting, and they do not appear to be as forthcoming as they were after the classified briefing that took place yesterday. And it could be to what you're alluding to. This was not a briefing that was specifically about this situation with the balloons or the other unidentified objects. This was something that was scheduled long before even the Chinese spy balloon popped up. This was really more focused on the defense strategy as it relates to China as a possible military threat. And it was a classified briefing, and the members that are coming out right now seem to be, abiding by the rules of that classified status and not lending too much information as to what they discussed. They did say that the balloon issue was touched upon, but not in great detail, especially given the fact that they'd already had a briefing the day before. Now, John Tester was among the people that did speak briefly after he left this briefing. He told our reporters that are stationed outside of the briefing room that, first of all, he doesn't think it would hurt for the president to come out and talk about this, to lend some specific information as to what exactly is going on. And he also kind of tamped down some of the reports that perhaps this was an accident by the Chinese to allow this spy balloon to head into American airspace, saying that we should never assume that the Chinese Communist Party is doing anything by accident, specifically if it's something that could be an intelligence benefit to them. So they're just starting to trickle out, Chuck. We're just starting to get a sense of it, but it does seem as though this was a lot more focused on China writ large than it was specifically related to this balloon or the other identified objects.
And Ryan, no, just to clarify, let me just clarify that point. Senator Tester or anybody else hasn't said, I mean, are they confirming what Jake Sullivan seemed to indicate this morning, that these other three objects were likely benign, I think is the word he used?
Yeah, they all seem to be in agreement with that this was not a real national security threat, at least from the information that they have been given at this point. But they also reiterate the fact, Chuck, that they still don't know very much, that they've only been given just a little bit more information than we've been given about this, and they certainly want answers. Yeah. And they specifically are looking for a policy plan, which they feel has been absent in these discussions.
Well, that's a perfect transition to Brussels and Courtney. Courtney, what struck me about your interview with Secretary Austin, and I want to play, I know we want to play some more of it, is sometimes he sort of struck me as being in the same position you and I are in, which is I'm not 100% sure what's going on. And at the end of the day, I assume he has more access to this information than you or I do. Is that the impression you got?
One would think so. I mean, we all want the access that he's got, but the reality is he's probably knows a lot more than we do. He didn't deny, he didn't dispute this latest intelligence community leaning towards these last three objects being, as you said, non-threatening in nature, that they were not nefarious, that they were benign. But he didn't say anything more about them. They don't seem to know where they came from, who owns them. He said no one has claimed ownership still to date on them, and they don't really know what their purpose was. Secretary Austin also defended the U.S. military's recommendation to take out these three objects, saying that they presented a potential threat to civilian aviation and that they weren't sure if they may have been surveilling sensitive sites. So that was ultimately what they made the decision. He cited the fact that they were taking the American public's best interests to heart when they made those decisions. But he also acknowledged, Chuck, that none of these balloons or objects presented any kind of an actual threat to Americans on the ground. So we also know now that the U.S., these objects like this, balloons or whatever they are, they may have been flying over U.S. airspace or near U.S. airspace for some time, and the U.S. just didn't know it. The U.S. military radars just weren't honed in enough on smaller objects and slower moving objects like these. So I asked him specifically, now that they're seeing more of these, does this represent some sort of an intelligence failure that they didn't know about them in the past? Here's what he had to say.
The fact that the U.S. military didn't know about these until recently, is that an intelligence failure? Was that a military failure?
No, it's how you use your radars. We typically are focused on things that are moving fast, and so it's a bit more difficult to collect on slow-moving objects like a balloon. And as they made adjustments, they were able to see some of that.
So I asked him if the American public has been potentially at danger from these sorts of things for years and just not known it if they've been flying around without the U.S. having to shoot them down. And he referred me to the FAA for that. Chuck?
Well, and that's, I guess I'm going to come back to that before we transition. there seems to be almost an embracing of the compartmentalization aspect of this, right? And I remember after 9/11, we had the whole stovepiping situation. Well, somebody knew this and somebody knew this, but they weren't sharing their data. It doesn't sound like there's a lot of coordination, or at least it's being used as an excuse for why we didn't know these things.
But the truth is there is coordination, especially when you're talking about over North America. The DOD, the FAA, both Canadians and the U.S., they all sit in the same, in some cases, they sit in the same room, and they can coordinate and deconflict. I think the difference here is their radars would often, if they picked up things like these smaller objects, like the one that was shot down over Lake Huron, it was at 20,000 feet, it was smaller, it didn't seem to have any propulsion mechanism or heat signature. They may not have seen that, or if they did, they would maybe assume it was clutter in the past. Now they're paying more attention to these sorts of things. But the question that we just can't get answered is, to what end? Does that mean we're going to see more of these things shot down going forward? Or are they going to be scrambling jets to look at every potential balloon that's flying over the U.S.? And we can't seem to get an answer. I suspect that we're going to hear more about the policy going forward once this review is done.
Ryan, I'm curious. I know the head of the FAA, I think, was testifying today, and it was on a separate topic. We assumed some of this would come up. Did he have much to add to this conversation?
Not beyond the kind of the broad lines that we've gotten from the other agencies. You know, I think there was some confirmation that there was a threat, or perhaps a concern, threat's probably not the right word, about how it could interfere with commercial air traffic and things along those lines. And but in terms of any kind of solid confirmation as to where these objects come from, why the decision was made to shoot them down, and what it could mean for the future, there wasn't a whole lot of discussion about that. He was really, you know, the purpose of him being there was to talk more about kind of the situation with airline travel in the United States in general, and that's really what he was pressed on.
I want to foreshadow something. People might be shocked that sometimes some interviews get taped before I come on this hour, and I have an interview with Admiral Stavridis in a few minutes. And he points to an event that we're waiting on to whether it's going to happen or not. And that event is Speaker McCarthy going to Taiwan. Ryan, what's the latest on that?
Well, Kevin McCarthy won't confirm that he's planning to go to Taiwan. He also won't say that he's definitely not going. So it's one of those things where there have been rumors and reports about it. He certainly is not batting down those questions. When asked about it specifically, he says he has no comment on whether or not he plans to go there. Interestingly enough, Chuck, I was in a briefing with him a couple of weeks ago where he was specifically asked you know, if he was concerned that the Chinese government has made it public that they don't think he should travel to Taiwan. And his answer to that was simply, the Chinese government does not tell me what to do. So, you know, there's no doubt that Kevin McCarthy wants to appear to have a very bold and defiant stance when it comes to the Chinese Communist government. And he's really found himself in a similar position to Speaker Pelosi. Once it was floated that she might go to Taiwan, if for some reason those plans change, it may put him in a difficult position. So no plans yet, Chuck. If it does happen, it would likely happen later this summer.
Yeah, no, as like I said, I'm foreshadowing a moment here that viewers will know why I asked you that question now. Ryan, thank you for that. Courtney, let's stick around a minute, because you also spoke to Secretary Austin about the status of the war in Ukraine. And I want to let our viewers hear a bit of that part of your interview. Here's a chunk of it.
So you feel confident that in the coming months, maybe by the end of this year even, that Ukraine and Russia will come to a negotiating table to talk?
Courtney, I've done enough fighting to know that you should never predict an outcome of a fight, but what you should do is do everything that you can to shape the fight so that there is a possibility of success. And we think we're going to do that. We're going to give the Ukrainians everything that they need to be successful and to hopefully change the dynamics on the battlefield. That's what we're looking to do. But whether or not, you know, how things unfold is left to be seen. I think at the end of the day, we're going to find that the Ukrainians are pretty good fighters. The reason that they did well at the beginning of this war is because we had spent time training them, training their soldiers, their non-commissioned officers since 2014, and we saw some of their NCOs exercising initiative, doing things to attack the Russian formations in asymmetric fashion early on, and that had really, really good effects. So the training that we're providing now on the platforms and the maneuver training that the combined arms training that we're going to provide them, I think is going to pay dividend. Now, how it shapes up, we'll see.
Courtney, that was an incredibly detailed answer he gave to you about a war that he made clear we're not fighting. Right at the beginning of your first question on Ukraine, I didn't include that part in there. He said, unprovoked, unprompted, by the way, we're not having a war with Russia. Ukraine's fighting Russia. And then he walks you through all of that. I guess the point that he seemed to want to drive home and you picked up on clearly, and what other U.S. officials are saying is, this war can't last another year. We're not going to say it that way, but it can't last another year. Right, Ukraine? Like, that does seem to be the general push American officials are trying to give here, right?
I mean, that's every indication is leading in that direction, right? There is so much emphasis on this coming Ukrainian counteroffensive. So preparing them to defend against the Russian offensive and then preparing them for their own counteroffensive. And the clear goal here is to front load as much equipment and weapons as the U.S. and the allies can provide them so that they'll be in a good position and they can put Russia on their back heels, maybe even break through some of the Russian lines, particularly down in the south and the southeast, so that maybe they can force Russia to the negotiating table. But it's important to point out, Chuck, that neither side is showing any interest in negotiating at this point, despite the fact that the U.S. has said repeatedly that there's not going to be a military solution here. This has to end at the table, at the diplomacy table. So every indication is that they are really putting a lot into this offensive and counteroffensive with the hope that it may yield some sort of a diplomatic outcome.
I thought what was interesting there, Courtney, is you offered him the off-ramp of saying, boy, we could be in the same spot here a year from now for the second anniversary. And it was like everything he could say is like, he didn't quite say it. It seemed like we better not be here. I mean, it seemed to be all but saying that.
Yeah. And I specifically asked him that. I said, so do you think that this means that by the end of this year, there won't be a war? Because I got to tell you, Chuck, for the past couple of months, the one thing I keep hearing from defense officials and administration officials is that the front lines aren't moving much, and they're not, and they don't see big dramatic changes in how things are going on the war, and they're concerned that a year from now or 2 years from now, the war won't have changed that much. So the lines may move here and there, but there's still going to be this conflict where both sides are dug in, and it's just a matter of where the heavy fighting is occurring across those front lines. So the fact that Secretary Austin seems to think that it may not still be going on a year from now is pretty telling.
Well, he certainly believes it certainly means he has a lot of confidence in this coming spring offensive. I guess we're all going to find out where things stand when summer begins.
Yeah.
Courtney Kube, in one of the more underrated cities in the world, in Brussels, doing a lot of work, obviously. Yeah. Courtney, thank you very much. And make sure to tune into NBC Nightly News tonight with Lester Holt. You'll get more of that exclusive interview that Courtney had with the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. He doesn't talk a lot, so it's important when we hear from him. Don't miss it. Coming up, as I foreshadowed, my interview with a top former military commander about the state of U.S.-China tensions and the questions facing U.S. forces as they prepare for a potential confrontation. Plus, Nikki Haley beats the competition to join the competition, jumping into the race to challenge Donald Trump for the 2024 presidential nomination on the GOP side. If you ain't first, you're last. It's the Ricky Bobby rule matter here. That's ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. NBC News was the first to break the story of this Chinese spy balloon when it was already over U.S. airspace. And that was the first time the American people knew about it or the American government confirmed it. But the Washington Post is now reporting that the U.S. began actually tracking that specific balloon from its launch near China's southern coast, all the way through going to the, appeared to be headed toward the U.S. territory of Guam. And then at some point it made an unexpected turn north, which could indicate China never intended for the balloon to fly over the continental United States. But more importantly, apparently we were tracking it from takeoff. There's no indication U.S. officials ever reached out to Chinese officials about the balloon until after we shot it down. Courtney Kube asked Defense Secretary about communications between the two countries. Here's what he said.
Are you worried that with these heightened tensions, with this balloon, with this back and forth, Are you worried that there could be a miscommunication that could have potentially dire consequences?
I've reached out to Minister Wei before. I've talked to him face to face. I've emphasized the need to maintain open lines of communication. He actually recognizes the need to do that. But in this case, and in the case we had a couple of months ago, when something happens, they somehow tend to shut down their military channels of communication. I think that's dangerous, but it won't stop me from continuing to encourage them to open up the lines of communication. I think that's the right thing to do.
Joining me now is retired Admiral James Stavridis. He's a former Supreme Allied Commander at NATO. He's also, of course, an NBC News Chief International Analyst. Jim, I want to go back, though, to speaking of open lines of communication and transparency. I'd like to talk about the U.S. government, because it certainly seems to me that the American public never would have known about this spy balloon had it not been visible to the naked eye in Montana. Is that fair?
I think that is fair, and I think it's unfortunate. Perhaps one of the big takeaways here is going to be a little more transparency. You don't want the American public waking up on a Tuesday morning, looking up into the sky and discovering Chinese surveillance.
So here we are, tracking this balloon from takeoff, knowing full well what it did. Now, in hindsight now, Jim, this sort of explains why we didn't shoot it down right away. We had an idea of what it was likely doing. Then we thought it was probably a little bit veered off course, so we thought we'd keep track of it. But it sounds like we knew exactly what it was and never intended to shoot it down until there was an uproar.
That certainly is one way to interpret the events, and it's hard to dispute it. I think what we ought to do is kind of take a deep breath here and wait until the U.S. Navy recovers the remains of this satellite structure that's parked underneath the balloon.
Right.
We'll get that thing. We'll get the pieces and parts. We'll take a look at it. We'll reverse engineer it. Mm-hmm. I think we'll have a better idea of motivation at that point.
What's going on in low orbit? How much do we one thing I've learned about the Chinese is that when they are using a technology, it's likely they didn't invent it. It's likely they borrowed it or copied it. So I'm guessing, well, we're not guessing, we kind of know this. What are we doing in low orbit, and what are we doing with balloons?
I think it's well known that the U.S. intelligence capability to collect signals intelligence, meaning cell phone conversations, for example, radar emissions, explosions, fires, electro-optic. We have superb coverage from high space and from, as you say, low Earth orbit satellites. And yeah, do we use balloons? We do. I'm going to, however, on this one, in terms of Beijing accusing the U.S. of flying balloons over China, I don't believe it for a minute. John Kirby, our Rear Admiral, knocked it down hard. And it's unlikely to me in the extreme that we would violate sovereign airspace that way. Extremely provocative.
Why do you say that? I mean, the Soviets and the United States, for a while we had an unspoken agreement to violate each other's sovereignty, and then we actually had an agreement to do it, at the Open Skies Agreement. So I don't mean to dispute your denial there, but why should we just assume that?
We should, because we are cognizant of exactly what Lloyd Austin was just saying, that these are potentially very provocative moments. Think of the shoot down U-2, Gary Powers, Cold War.
Sure.
And, by the way, the people who are flying around in the jets that are taking these shots and so forth, it's not Tony Blinken up there in a Hornet with all that judgment and diplomacy and years of experience. The potential for something to go sideways and lead to a provocative moment is very high. That's why the U.S. doesn't do it, and that's why China should not do it.
I guess where I'm struggling here with sort of the U.S. version of events is we talk about trying to communicate with the Chinese after we shot down the balloon. We're not getting any reports about any communications with the Chinese while we were tracking this balloon. Was that a mistake?
I think it was. And from the moment it looked as though that balloon was drifting toward U.S. sovereign airspace, I would have thought our excellent ambassador in Beijing, Nick Burns, our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, would have been calling all cars in Beijing, trying to find out what's going on. Evidently, that did not happen. I think there'll be a lot of lessons learned, Chuck, not only in how to shoot down a balloon, but how to prevent the moment when you have to shoot it down. I'll close with this. One of my idols, World War II Admiral Ernest King, was asked once, what's the mark of a great ship handler? And he said, never get in a situation that requires great ship handling. We missed a few turns here.
Yeah, and it leads me to this uncomfortable conclusion, which is we know tensions are pretty high with China. What does de-escalation look like, and is it just a timeout right now that we need?
I think timeout is not a bad way to put it. I've been saying the marker is Tony Blinken. Watch for how quickly we can reconstitute his trip. The negative marker would be if Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy chose this moment to announce a trip to Taipei. I hope he doesn't do that, and I hope Tony Blinken can get his trip back together. That would detension this relationship.
Those are two great events to forecast toward, one way or the other, Jim. Admiral Stavridis, always good to get your expertise. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Chuck.
Coming up, Nikki Haley kicks off her campaign against former President Trump for the Republican presidential nomination. And not surprisingly, he's already kicking right back. We'll have the latest from the trail. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. It is a busy news day. Nikki Haley made her presidential run double for real official at a rally today in South Carolina. The former UN ambassador and former governor of South Carolina is now the second announced candidate in the 2024 presidential field. And as she alluded to, would be the first woman president if she makes her way to the White House. Haley's kickoff speech was a mix of biography and contemporary Republican politics with a healthy dose of hits on President Biden. Take a listen.
America is not past our prime. It's just that our politicians are past theirs. Joe Biden isn't leading from behind. He's not leading at all. It is unthinkable that Americans would look at the sky and see a Chinese spy balloon looking back at us. We won't win the fight for the 21st century if we keep trusting politicians from the 20th century.
One policy proposal from Haley's speech that also took a swipe at President Biden: mandatory mental competency tests for politicians over 75. Although that would also apply to Donald Trump, who is 76. And in fact, just about every dig at Biden also seemed to be a subtle dig at Trump, for what it's worth. Haley didn't take any direct shots at her former boss. But as I noticed, she did specifically urge the party to move on from its past.
I know America is better than all the division and distractions that we have today. And I'm confident that the American people agree. We're ready to move past the stale ideas and faded names of the past. And we are more than ready for a new generation to lead us into the future.
Faded names of the past. I don't know if you call that subtle. Ali Vitale is on the trail for us in South Carolina following Nikki Haley's newly launched presidential campaign. And Ali, I think we ought to get rid of the word subtle. I mean, that announcement speech was a contrast with Donald Trump, pure and simple, but it was disguised as a hit on Joe Biden.
It was, and it's almost a general election speech, but Nikki Haley, of course, has to get through an entire primary against her former boss in order to get to a general election against, theoretically, President Joe Biden. I think what we're watching here is the beginning of a strategy where she's trying to take on Trump by putting it through the lens of taking on Biden, which is to say threading the needle of not alienating the Trump base, but also going at him and trying to make a differentiating factor between herself and Trump. I think it might end up being too cute by half, though. I mean, you know what it's like out here on the campaign trail. Everything in Republican politics right now is through the lens of Donald Trump. You don't have to mention him in your announcement, but at a certain point, you are going to have to go at the only other person who is actually in this race, and you're going to have to do it by more than saying, well, my age and my face and my entire persona are new and different than his. So for an opening salvo, this is clearly the strategy, but it's unclear that it's actually enough.
Allie, what can you tell me? I know that there are various ways that Donald Trump has sort of pushed back on her today. I've seen some of the online stuff, but I think he did an interview as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, what he's trying to do is tie her to his past praise, the past praise that she has leveraged upon him. Obviously, she's someone who worked for him. He previously talked about a phone call that they had just before she announced, where she said, in his words, that he was the greatest president ever. She's going to have to explain, having been on multiple sides of Donald Trump after the January 6th insurrection, during the second impeachment, saying that she wouldn't run for president in 2024 if he ran for president in 2024, because clearly that's where we are right now. And for Haley, she's going to have to explain that, whether it's right now, clearly today, she's doing some interviews, including with our own NBC's Craig Melvin, but also as she gets back out on the campaign trail, she's going to Iowa and New Hampshire over the course of the next week and a half, really road testing that message, which, you're right, had a great amount of bio in it, also some foreign policy, which you don't typically hear in a presidential kickoff. So it was all there. It's just a question of if she can defend it.
Well, that's what we're all watching there, but I think she is certainly a compelling candidate and certainly worthy of your time following her on the trail. Ali Vitale, terrific reporting today, and as always, stay safe on the trail. And joining me now is Rob Godfrey. He was a top aide to Nikki Haley while she served as governor of South Carolina. Rob, I appreciate you doing this. Think of it as a little bit of, okay, help us get to know her a little bit better. You heard her announcement speech. What struck out to you that was familiar, and what stuck out to you that was different?
Well, I think it was an upbeat speech. I think it was something that very much didn't need to take anyone on by name that she may be running against. I think in and of herself, Governor Haley, by virtue of her story and her strengths, her story as the daughter of Indian immigrants who taught her every day how blessed she was to grow up in America, a successful governor who created jobs and changed lives and reformed state government, and an ambassador who was unafraid to take on America's antagonists and America's rivals and stand with our allies. I think that what she did was effectively launch a campaign that was upbeat, that was about renewal and American pride, and in doing so, contrast herself with candidates who are talking about grievances of the past, who want to relitigate elections of the past, who want to continue to talk about issues of the past. It was very much a generational argument that she made without taking any sorts of direct shots at anybody she has to take on in this nominating process.
I'm sure you saw this headline. I think it was the folks at the Bulwark had this headline over an analysis of Nikki Haley. A terrific presidential candidate if this were 2015. And I say that, and I want to ask you about it because your description of her announcement, to me, was similar to the description that was made of Jeb Bush's announcement, the description that was made of Scott Walker's announcement. Two guys like Nikki Haley, I would argue, cut from the same sort of be optimistic, be forward-looking, don't get mucked in the past. And that didn't work with voters in 2016. They wanted grievance. Is that her sort of, whether it works or not, is whether voters want optimism or whether voters still want grievance?
Well, I think voters still want optimism because optimism speaks to the future and optimism speaks to a vision of the future. But voters also want to talk in these early states, whether it's caucus goers in Iowa or it's voters in New Hampshire and South Carolina. They expect and demand to talk to each of these candidates one-on-one, face-to-face about the issues that matter to them. Some of those issues that are going to drive them are going to be emotional. Some of us are going to see as grievance issues. I'm sure that Governor Haley will be ready to discuss those issues with them. But let's make no mistake. In any of the races that Donald Trump has previously run, he's never had a foil that's quite like Nikki Haley, someone who has her story and her background, her association with him, and her association with a successful record on her own. And what's different about that foil is that she has some strengths that he's never faced before. One, he doesn't have she doesn't have the baggage of being before the American people for 30 previous years that Hillary Clinton may have had. But what she has that he's never faced before is the ability to be disciplined, to not be distracted by the things that many candidates are distracted by. And she has the ability to punch back and absorb punches when those come, which we anticipate with a chaos candidate is going to come with it, in the context of Donald Trump stuff.
Rob, I'm curious, one thing that she didn't mention in her announcement, and I thought she might at least allude to it, was sort of that moment, that leadership moment that I think the nation remembers, Mother Emanuel Church, and she sort of led the effort. She led the effort to get the Confederate flag off the State House grounds there. Why not bring it up today? I mean, it's a big moment in her political resume.
Well, if you remember yesterday in the soft launch of her campaign and the campaign video, she talked about the fact that she looked hate right in the eyes, whether it was on the international stage or it was in Charleston in the aftermath of that shooting. So I think that was a part of the aftermath of the shooting, was a part of what she talked about very candidly in that video. And lowering and removing the Confederate flag from the State House grounds is something that people will never be able to divorce from the legacy of Nikki Haley. She was right at that time. But let's be clear, no one person deserves credit for that. That was something that happened because 9 lives that were innocent lives were taken by hateful, deranged gunmen. But that's something, her leadership there, something that will never be divorced from her legacy. And that moment is something that I'm sure will be something that reporters and that voters alike will talk about on the campaign, and history will judge well by.
Rob Godfrey, who was a longtime aide to Nikki Haley when she was the governor of South Carolina. Appreciate you coming on and sharing a bit of your experience. You got it. Thank you, sir. We have a lot more on Nikki Haley's kickoff and the delicate line she's trying to walk with Trump and also the current governor of Florida. That's next. Plus, we can't talk about trailblazing women in politics without talking about Dianne Feinstein. Let's take a moment to look at her historic career and the coming crowded fight to replace her next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Panel time. I'm joined today by the Axios senior politics reporter Eugene Scott, former Biden White House press secretary and MSNBC host Jen Psaki, and Jim Garrity, the senior political correspondent for the National Review. Jen, I'm going to start with you. You've put together presidential announcements. And Nikki Haley, give me first sort of, as presidential announcements go, what you think, and then what do you think of her as a candidate?
Well, I was thinking as I was watching it that the bar you want to cross is, does this person look presidential and real? And she did. I mean, she had a crowd behind her that were cheering. She looked like she was delivering, because think about the percentage of people who just see things on screens in airports and other places. So I think the announcement itself.
So as you're walking down, like catching your flight, you look up, oh, wow.
You're like,
Haley,
wow,
she
looks pretty good. Yeah. I know that sounds so superficial, but that's how people make decisions.
Things like this matter.
Initially, or they're intrigued. They're gonna Google her and look her up.
The Kamala Harris announcement was a terrific announcement.
Yes.
And it mattered a lot to her candidacy, didn't it?
So good announcement. The big question is, what is her lane in the Republican primary?
Well, Jim Garrity, what is her lane in the Republican primary?
I guess the idea is that Trump comes out as a older, tired, crazier version of his old one, no longer an unknown quantity, no longer someone Americans want to roll the dice on, and that for one reason or another, Ron DeSantis doesn't have it. That he doesn't have the charisma, and that all of a sudden someone who's served under Trump and who is seen as Trumpy enough, but who's also developed her own independent identity is there. Look, she's got an uphill climb. There's no doubt about it. But I think this was about as good a start as you could hope for if you're Nikki Haley.
And Eugene, this is what intrigues me about her candidacy. First of all, it's the simple fact. It's our version of the Ricky Bobby rule. If you ain't first, you're last. And being the first non-Trump, I think, mattered here.
Absolutely. But I think what's really important, and we could talk about Trump all we want, but her policies are unattractive to a lot of Americans. And whether or not she's going to be able to get people outside of her tribe on board, she talked about losing the popular vote 7 out of the last 8 times for Republicans. Is she going to be the one to win it with this political platform? Probably not when you look at where Americans stand right now.
And I guess the question I wonder, and Jim, I want to start with you with this and get to Jen on it, which is, I feel like her theory of winning this nomination is the same theory Jeb Bush had, the same theory Marco Rubio had, which is, I'm going to be the last person standing against Donald Trump, and when that happens, I'm going to look great.
I am cursed in this Republican primary so far. There are a lot of really promising...
It's so early, though.
Yeah, these curses start early. Republican governors, Republican senators who have solid records, and
Just
in ordinary circumstances...
Look like perfect candidates.
This is great. Yeah. And they're setting up the potential for a rerun of 2016, in which everybody beats each other up. Trump is his own unique identity and wins the primary with the plurality. You know, people forget that last time around he won a little bit more than 45% of the total votes cast in the Republican primary. Unfortunately, there were 16 other guys, and you never had a one-on-one race between Trump and Cruz or Trump and Kasich.
Right. We never had it. We always were looking for it, never had it. Jen, take this from the White House's perspective. What's interesting here is you got an idea of what the Biden hits are going to look like during the primary.
Yes.
A lot of age.
Yep.
That's going to come, and I don't think that's going to be just unique to her. I think you're going to hear that a lot. What else do you think they need to gird themselves for, and how should they be countering?
Well, you've also hear is it's been a failure, and his policies are a disaster. Now, they haven't really been the cars that have had their hoods lifted and kicked quite yet, where they're getting questions from voters and reporters and things, and people ask those questions.
Right.
So they do have to be prepared for that. Inflation, there are things like when you intellectually explain the cost of eggs, it's like, oh, there's lots of factors there, but they're going to throw those type of hits out there, costs and how they impact people every single day. For the White House, the best thing possible, though, is a huge Republican field. Because as much as they're all going to attack Biden, what is more interesting to everyone is, what is Nikki Haley saying about Ron DeSantis when she says something about Ron DeSantis? Who is Ron DeSantis going to attack? How is he going to go after Trump? That is what is going to get more coverage and attention. That is great for the White House.
And that, to me, is another part of this challenge for Nikki Haley, Eugene, which is, you know, to me, when you run for office, you're making a case for yourself, but it's like, why me, not them?
Right.
So why her and not Ron DeSantis? And she didn't even begin to answer that question today.
No, and I think she's relying quite a bit on narrative and her identity. She's different, she's unique, and I think we're in a time where many people in this country do want to see more diversity at the top of the ticket, and so she's leaning on that. I think she also pointed to her track record in handling some race issues in South Carolina, especially the shooting at that church in Charleston, and we know that DeSantis right now is not getting a lot of good press when it comes to racial issues, and so I think her argument is appealing to many voters of color who perhaps historically haven't looked at the GOP, letting them know that she could be a better option than the Florida governor.
Jim, the other thing that I'm curious about now, her candidacy will mean that every other person that announces after has to answer the question, aren't you diluting the field?
Yeah, it's first mover advantage.
Right, and this
right?
is, to me, what made her, I'm just sitting there going, if you're Asa, Tim, Chris,
Tim Scott,
you know, that's what I mean. I'm all these other, you're like, Nikki beat us.
Yes, and out of all of the other candidates in that race, Tim Scott also being from South Carolina. Look, we know, at least on the Republican side, Iowa's still going first, or at least as of this conversation. Yeah. New Hampshire, then Nevada, and South Carolina. South Carolina, for past cycles, has always been the one that decides it. Well, now we have not just an incumbent president who won South Carolina. We also have two candidates who were won statewide in South Carolina who are pretty darn popular with each other. Right. So if they split it 3 ways, nobody gets any advantage out of winning South Carolina or winning a close second, close third, something like that. Yeah. So in a very strange way, this might nullify the importance of South Carolina by having not one but two major
Well, not only that, and if Kristen Nunes is running, we're nullifying the importance of New Hampshire. This is what, all about Iowa.
Again,
just when everybody's
We've seen this movie before.
And just wait till they don't have the result for us. Because remember, the Republicans couldn't get the result for us. We're still wondering, Rick Santorum or Mitt Romney? Who won? We don't know.
Rick Santorum has an answer to that.
I was going to say, you had to spend a lot of time in the green room with it back in the day. Jen, I want to talk about another woman in politics today, and it's Dianne Feinstein. For my entire professional career, I have covered her from her Senate race onward. This is a person that is a trailblazer.
Yes.
And to watch how this is ending is hard to watch.
It is hard to watch.
I don't know if it's family, staff, but whatever's happening is not happening well enough. How's that? Whatever they're doing, they're not doing a good job.
Yeah, I think it is hard to watch. I mean, I grew up, high school, college, where she was one of the core trailblazers. That term is used a lot, but it is actually applicable to her.
She is.
She
yes.
is a trailblazer.
She is, yeah.
And she has had a tremendous career standing out there on a lot of important issues. This is one of those cases where you wish, as you're watching from the sideline, why couldn't they have made this decision 6 months ago, right? Or why couldn't they have
it's one of those,
and done it on her
terms. Why can't a family member come in? Why isn't somebody? It's like there's some, and I get it. We've all dealt with aging relatives and Eugene, but it's like, I also hate that. I mean, this is the circumstances with which she had to become mayor of San Francisco. She basically got the California Democratic Party off the mat when Republicans, guys like George Deukmejian were winning 2 terms. Okay, and when that is not a misprint when you're looking up your history of California politics. It just feels like it's tarnishing something here at the end that's unfair to her.
It does.
Nobody's looking out for her here.
And speaking of that, one thing that's really interesting, when you think about people who are new to American politics and don't know the role she played historically, what they know about her is these last couple of years. She has not been able to control the narrative. I was reading something last night about her being in local politics with Harvey Milk, and there are just so many rich stories that could be a part of her narrative. And maybe there's still time. Maybe there's still time to get on top of that.
Yeah, no, it is. Look, we've seen this with other. I mean, Fritz Hollings once infamously said, there's no better nursing home in America than the United States Senate.
It's hard to leave.
Thurmond. So one of the things I kind of is odd about this is we've seen the New York Times, lots of publications write the Dianne Feinstein is having serious memory issues, serious piece that usually would be the sort of thing that would spur a resignation within a month or two. And it didn't happen in this case. It just kind of kept going, and it just kept going.
Like I said, I don't know the situation, and I don't want to pretend to, but it does feel like family and staff are not. They may be thinking they're helping her, but it's not coming out that way. No. That's, I know it's not easy. Anyway, sorry to put you all in that uncomfortable situation. But anyway, Eugene, Jen, and Jim, thank you all. Up next, how one judge in one case is threatening access to abortion pills for women nationwide. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. One Texas judge has the power to severely limit access to abortion for women nationwide. Here's why. If he decides a case this month that could force a common abortion pill off the market completely. An anti-abortion rights group filed a lawsuit in Texas challenging the FDA's approval of a pill used for at-home medication abortions, and has asked the judge for a preliminary injunction to make the FDA take the pill out of circulation while the larger case is decided, not just in Texas, but across the entire country. The drug in question has been FDA approved for over 20 years, specifically for use alongside another pill to terminate pregnancies up to 10 weeks. More than half of the women in the United States who seek to end their pregnancy do so using medicated abortions or medication abortion. Chloe Atkins has been following this Texas lawsuit. And Chloe, I think that the thing that's the head scratcher is we understand injunctions that deal with sort of what's at stake. This is all about a Texas law. It has nothing to do with the nation's law. So how does this judge have the power?
Well, it was very intentional. These anti-abortion groups, they went judge shopping, essentially. They were looking for a jurisdiction that would be favorable to their suit, to their argument, which, as you eloquently laid out, they are asking for the FDA to reverse its approval of mifepristone, which has been on the market for 20-something years now and has been used by millions of people around the country. And they say in their suit, the anti-abortion groups, or the plaintiffs, I should say, they illustrate that, look, the FDA fast-tracked this process. It's harmful to people. And, of course, the FDA did quip back, saying, look, we took all the right processes here. This was through scientific approval. Many people have used this. But, Chuck, I really want to harp on the facts here. And the facts here are that, medication abortion, when using that 2-pill regimen, it is has almost 100% efficacy rate when terminating a pregnancy, and it has less than a 1% rate of major complications of having to go to the doctor's office or even the hospital. And medication abortion also is one of the most common ways that people are using or are doing so to terminate their pregnancy in this day and age. So what could happen here is if this judge out of Texas that is conservative leaning and that was appointed by Trump and has Christian and conservative affiliations, if he rules in their favor, mifepristone will be pulled from the market, Chuck.
So, and what this would mean is suddenly there would be, this would take the basic prescription that is used to end a pregnancy just completely off the market. What would happen next?
Well, what would happen next? We want to look at it from a twofold perspective. So we would likely see the FDA appeal the judge's decision to the Fifth Circuit Court. And they would then, given that the Fifth Circuit Court is conservative, it could wind up at the Supreme Court. But also, I do want to add that, we are seeing providers pivot to this misoprostol-only regimen, which is the other drug in that 2-pill regimen. That is just as safe and just as effective. So, Chuck, that is what we will see play out in the weeks to come if this judge does rule in favor of the plaintiffs.
And if they do, we'll obviously keep hearing this go through the courts as well. Chloe Atkins, terrific reporting on that. And thank you all for being with us this hour. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.